That's actually a really great segue into something that I wanted to get into, which is, as I mentioned, Jennifer Silva's book. Please stay tuned for her interview. I mean, it's really interesting. And she interviewed, as I said, like over 100 working class people, and I say this to her in the interview, like, the people she interviews, I mean, her interviews are so humanizing. Like, the people she interviews are both intensely rational and extremely idiosyncratic. And it just, like, it reminded me of like a lot of people I grew up around. So people who like would say things like, I mean, this is an example that she gives. She interviews a woman who is like, like, yeah, like, of course Trump is racist, but I'll probably vote for him. I mean, like, she was like a woman who was able to both condemn his racism, but also say like, well, I don't really see any other option. Like, I don't like any of the other candidates. And, I think that he could do something for me in addition to being a completely despicable human being. So there are a lot of stories like that in her book. So definitely please check that out. But for my segment, I wanted to kind of look at some of the broader trends around political participation today, and like look at who participates in politics and why. So when most people talk about the political divide today, they're really talking about political polarization, or animosity between Democrats and Republicans, right? So Ezra Klein has a new book on political polarization, which looks at this split. And then we hear this term a lot on the news. So I just picked this representative clip from CBS.
Increasingly, we Americans occupy alternate universes.
To be honest, I inherited a mess. It's a mess.
No, you inherited a fortune. We elected a mess.
There is very little common ground left, only battling perceptions of reality.
Are you all happy with the last 30 days?
Neither side seems to have much use for the other, and in this age of the internet and cable TV, very little is out of bounds.
Donald Trump, America's wealthiest hemorrhoid.
Democrats want to dissolve the borders. Isn't that what they wanted, open borders? Isn't that what the snake Obama did?
There are legions driving the country further and further apart.
President Trump has still done more for this country in the last 40 days than Barack Obama did in 8 years.
A Pew study finds 81% of voters say they cannot agree with the other side on basic facts.
So, to be fair, there really are signs that political polarization in the US has sharpened over the last few decades. However, that said, there's also growing evidence that, the real split in the US might actually be between people who follow politics closely and those who don't. So this was written about in the New York Times, but recently a team of researchers conducted a study where they found that the overwhelming majority of Americans really don't follow politics at all. So in their study, they found that about 15 to 20% of people follow politics closely, and then as many as 85% of people only follow politics casually or not at all. And then on top of that, the researchers also find that the sort of self-professed political junkies often have very different priorities than people who don't follow politics closely. So, for example, they write, Democrats and Republicans who don't follow politics closely believe that low hourly wages are one of the most important problems facing the country. But for hard partisans, the issue barely registers. So I think this is all to say, there's a pretty substantial chunk of people who have concerns that we would probably gloss as political, such as raising wages, but they're not constantly posting or paying attention to politics. They don't think of themselves as political junkies. And I think the most troubling thing is that they're increasingly not participating in politics. So on that last point, there are obviously multiple factors that lead people to disengage from politics. I guess I think that one major barrier is that the majority of working people, unfortunately, actually have very little influence on politics, even when they do try to express their political preferences. So, a lot of you are probably familiar with this study, but a few years ago, the political scientists Martin Gilens and Ben Page, they sort of released this bombshell study where they looked at a decade of data to try to quantify how policymakers respond to different groups. And they basically found that legislators are so disproportionately responsive to the policy preferences of economic elites and of the business lobby that the influence of the average citizen on policymaking today is essentially zero. So they wrote a follow-up book and were interviewed in the Washington Post. And I just want to read a quote from that interview. So they write, even big majorities, 60 to 80% of Americans, get the policy changes they want only about 40% of the time. This has real consequences. Millions of Americans are denied government help with jobs, incomes, healthcare, or retirement pensions. They do not get action against climate change or stricter regulation of the financial sector or a tax system that asks the wealthy to pay a fair share. On all these issues, wealthy Americans tend to want very different things than average Americans do, and the wealthy usually win. So on a similar note, in 2018, a different group of researchers looked at the disconnect between members of Congress and their constituents, and they found that Congress members of both parties and their top aides pretty consistently misjudge what their constituents actually want. So for example, Congress members really tend to underestimate the public's support for things like background checks on gun sales. They also underestimate quite a bit how much their constituents support things like raising the minimum wage and government spending on infrastructure. And then, of course, at the same time, in 2017, Congress passes Trump's tax cuts, which were very, very unpopular with the public. So this is all to say that you essentially have a political system that is wildly out of touch with most working people and at the same time extremely responsive to what rich people want, right? So given that, I don't think it's a huge shock that poor and working class people are increasingly dropping out of the political process. Now that said, just to reference, something that we talked about last week when Amber Frost was on, while people are disillusioned with a political system, by and large, they don't want to get rid of the government. They just want a government that actually works for them, right? So we have a lot of studies of non-voters, and they pretty consistently show that non-voters want more government interaction or want more government intervention, which kind of goes against the fact that they don't vote, right? But we have these studies that, sort of consistently show that non-voters are more likely than regular voters to support initiatives like raising the minimum wage and increased government spending on healthcare, public education, and social safety net benefits. And this which is on the screen right now, is just one study from California. But you can see, the graph here shows that that people who don't vote really do favor more state support when it comes to the safety net. And they also say, at least from this one study from California, that they want the government to do more to reduce inequality compared to people who vote on a regular basis. So, what this suggests to me is that the universal programs that I know we're always talking about on this channel, like Medicare for All, they'll obviously materially help the working class, but I think they'll also go a long way in helping to break us out of this kind of vicious feedback loop where, we have a political system that doesn't work well or respond to the preferences of working class people. So they increasingly disengage, which then means, of course, that elites have even more influence on politics because they're overrepresented at the polls. So, another way of putting it is if people who want stronger safety net programs actually start to see that the political system can deliver that to them, they'll be more inclined to participate in the future. And, trying to reach non-voters was, of course, this major part of the Bernie Sanders campaign. And unfortunately, in 2020, as we all know, it was not successful. But I guess I still think that over the next 5 to 10 years, we just have to continue this project of trying to win back working class voters, especially in rural America. And when I say we should focus on rural America, like that's not just a moral obligation, although arguably it is, because, these are parts of the country that have been hit really hard by deindustrialization and unemployment. Often rural areas struggle with, the opioid crisis. So there is kind of a moral obligation to help rural workers. But I would argue that focusing on rural areas also can be strategic, right? Because, we hear all the time that institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College are, anti-democratic and unfairly favor smaller states or rural states. And I think that that's all true. Like, I wish we could abolish those institutions. But the unfortunate reality as of now is that it's almost impossible to change the structure of the Senate, right? I mean, like, maybe we'll eventually add DC and Puerto Rico as states. But for the time being, we have to find a way to advance a left economic agenda under the system that we have. And I think that trying to win some rural districts might be one way of going about that. And of course, as I said, as we know from the Bernie campaign, it isn't going to be easy. This is definitely an uphill battle. But I don't really see an alternative. The Democratic elite's position is essentially to write off these areas, right? To try to, I guess, let so-called demographic destiny run its course. But I think that this is a risky proposition too. And I think that you only have to look at the 2020 election for some proof of that. If you look, for example, at a number of border towns in Texas, whose residents are, of course, predominantly working class Latino immigrants, you can really see that between 2016 and 2020, tons of those voters shifted to Trump. Perhaps even more of those voters dropped out, as David alluded to earlier. And this is after months of pundits speculating that Texas might turn blue because of demographic changes in the state. And I want to quickly shout out a new article by Megan Day called "The Indifferent and the Defiant," which is in the new issue of Jacobin, because she kind of gets into this phenomenon more, and she does some reporting from some of those border towns.